Hello and welcome to the Joe Ligato Show. I'm your host, Dr. Joe Ligato, and today we're going to be reviewing an article on Arctos on the death of the family unit and what that means for the wider world. And so we see here the article is titled "The Funeral Dirge for the Family," and the subtitle is "The Fertile and Long-Lasting Heterosexual Family Unit is in steep decline among Europeans," which explains the dramatic drop in their birth rates. This decline has many secondary causes, but they all lead back to a single primary cause: the excessive individualism associated with egalitarianism. And so I talk about how bad individualism is for society quite frequently on this channel. And we know that in at least American society, individualism wasn't even really the norm for a decent part of its history. In fact, the part of its history when it was most successful in the early 1900s, it was actually a very communitarian society. And so we've not actually seen the benefits of individualism, but we've seen very major downsides to individualism in the fact that there's significant evidence that very small but cohesive groups can outcompete everyone else in an individualistic society because everyone else is working as an individual unit while a collectivistic group is working as a cohesive whole. Paradoxically, the origin of individualism lies in Christianity. Nothing really opposes I'm going to be interested to see why they think that is, because I typically consider it to be something associated with the Enlightenment era instead of with Christianity as a whole. Nothing really opposes the traditional heterosexual family, but everything is discouraging it, starting with the general ideological character of our time. Okay, so let's see what we think about this. I would say, in terms of nothing really opposes the traditional heterosexual family, I think that is true, that there is not a realistic alternative to the traditional heterosexual family. We've not found anything that works, and to put this in kind of a broader context, we know when it comes to Christianity too, that Christianity and religion as a whole, the new atheist movement really tried to topple that, and there was no really productive alternative to having religion in people's day-to-day lives. So what we see, both with the traditional heterosexual family unit and with the decline of religion, both of those are instances where the modern world has toppled structures that were created in the olden world, and they haven't given us a realistic alternative, something that actually functions successfully in modern society. Okay, so in my view, the article goes on, the ultimate cause of the slow decline of the couple and the traditional family lies not with the ideology of the conservative right, which is bound up with the Enlightenment and the triumph of individualism, consumerism, feminism, and so on. Yeah, I definitely consider the Enlightenment to be one of the major causes of modern day ills, because it was very unrealistic. It wasn't something that was tried and tested and found to be successful. It was things that were enacted wholesale on a very large scale that did not end up working, but we ended up sticking with those ideas. And you see triumphs of individualism, consumerism, feminism, and so on being some of the offspring of the Enlightenment. These aspects are pertinent, but they are secondary causes. The principal reason for the decline of enduring fertile family as of the stable heterosexual couple is the conflation of conjugality with sexual love or marriage for love. Okay, that's an interesting one. I'd be interested to see why they think that's related to Christianity, and so why. I believe they blamed individualism on Christianity. I don't know if they necessarily blamed the decline of the family unit on individualism. Okay, so what they're saying here is that kind of an excessive hedonism, even an excessive individualism, things like that could lead to people having a rose-tinted colored glasses version of marriage, and they're not recognizing that the primary goal of marriage is to produce future generations. I can see that. I think that's overall a decent take on the situation. So this is a conflation. The article goes on 3 levels: lineage, sex, and love. It is a distant and paradoxical consequence of the Christian vision of marriage and sex. I say this with all due moderation and caution that paradoxically, bourgeois marriage, which was the outcome of Christian love, was able to reach a point of equilibrium, but it has gone past this point. In a world of perpetual becoming, there's never any lasting equilibrium. All is subject to reconstruction, all is subject to readjustment. Okay, so I think what they're getting at here is that Christianity and its version of marriage was beneficial up to a certain point, and then people took it too far, and they thought that if going in that direction was beneficial, then continuing to go in that direction would continue to be beneficial. And that's not how things typically work. It's not that if one extreme is wrong, the other extreme is the correct answer. A lot of the time in the middle, some moderate amount is the correct answer. And it looks like in terms of things like marrying for love, you could take that too far, which sounds weird, but it certainly is the case where you might try to marry for love, and then you recognize that there's no amount of love that would necessarily make you happy or completely satisfied, in which case you decide that there's no reason for the marriage in the beginning. And so I could see how this argument for marriage for love instead of marriage for producing future generations could be something that leads to detrimental consequences for society, at least taken to the extreme. Okay, so the disappearance of the lasting couple might be asked whether an overly refined sexuality marked less, let us say, by sensuality or erotic individualism, that's an interesting way of saying sexuality, erotic individualism, is not compatible with the traditional large family. The erotomaniac is not identified with the image of the family father, nor the liberated woman with that of the family mother. Okay, so what they're saying here is that the man who sleeps around and I don't know, I think they would typically call that person a Chad. And then the liberated woman, the kind of free butterfly you typically think of, or that grows up to be the kind of wine aunt, is not conducive. Those images of adult male and female role models are not conducive for having a family unit that can continue on the civilization. So they go on to say sexual austerity seems to be the condition in the West for stable couples with numerous children, just as the inevitable and necessarily hypocritical separation between open conjugal sexuality and dissimulated libidinal sexuality is a paradoxical condition for the stable, fertile couple. Okay. Deceiving one's spouse is not a case of simply having discrete sexual adventures, but of having a stable, permanent lover that is breaking the conjugal and familial pact, which is not simply a matter of sex and may not even include sex. Okay, that's interesting. On the other hand, the problem can be approached from different directions. Society cannot reproduce itself in the long term if there is a confusion and equivalence of roles between men and women. I'll come back to this after we finish the paragraph. The stable and fertile couple presupposes recognition of the radical differentiation between the genders, which is completely contrary to the current prevailing ideology. Okay. So, I believe this is true, where I believe that to a decent extent, the dichotomy, the duality of sex, of males and females, came about because there needed to be some degree of specialization of people's roles. And so there are distinctions between men and women because it made the most sense evolutionarily for some people to take on certain responsibilities and other people to take on other certain responsibilities. And so the way I tend to see it, and I've been told that this isn't the best because one of the terms has some negative connotations. I don't really agree with that, but I'll go over exactly what that is in a second. I think the differentiation of responsibilities typically comes down to men are supposed to be doing the productive work in society of growing society in terms of the products and services offered within that civilization, doing the political work of maintaining the civilization, the governance of the civilization, the protection of the civilization, whereas the woman's primary role is functioning as the reproductive role within society, and so they are actually producing the next generation. And so I've been told that making that differentiation between productive and reproductive work can sound a bit disparaging because it has the assumption that reproductive work is not a type of productive work. But I don't think you necessarily need to put productive work on a pedestal, and it could be that productive and reproductive work are equivalent in terms of their necessity for a functioning civilization. And so we're seeing that a lot of people who would be able to pass on their competence, their knowledge onto future generations are simply not, because they are focusing entirely on productive work and not doing any of the reproductive work. Part of that, I believe, comes from the fact that we have put both men and women in the workplace. Not that women are not necessarily capable of the work. I do think that they're capable of the work. But because of the fact that they evolutionarily have been responsible for the reproductive work of society. And so that's the fertility rate, and the fact that it is pretty low. In a lot of countries, people have enough children, or they have the amount of children they want. But unfortunately, society has convinced primarily women that they want to have fewer children so that they can live a free life, so that they can work. I don't know why you'd necessarily want to work in most cases, but they've convinced women of that. And so to a decent extent over the past, I would say, century, women have convinced themselves that they want fewer children. And whether that's true or not, maybe they actually do want fewer children even outside the propaganda, we can say pretty conclusively that that does not build a functioning civilization. And so individualism tells us the individual's desires is really what should be the primary interest of concern. If you have a collectivistic perspective, though, you have to consider what is most important, what is most beneficial for the civilization. And I would say that having a couple have a distinction between productive work for the functioning of society and reproductive work for the functioning of society is incredibly important. We're seeing that in places like South Korea, like Japan, like all of Western civilization, where in terms of fertility rate, you need every couple to have 2.1 children in order to make sure that the upcoming generations are stable in terms of population numbers. And it's 2.1 because for every 2 people, you need 2.1 offspring, because some are going to die like early on in life, and so they're not going to be able to reproduce. So you need, instead of just 2, you need 2.1. Now, that is just for maintaining a stable population. If you wanted to do, say, colonize the stars and expand humanity, you would need to expand the population of humanity, in which case you would need a fertility rate higher than 2.1. We have some countries like South Korea, which last I heard had a something like 0.8 fertility rate. And you're seeing that things like clothing stores for children in places like South Korea and Japan are actually closing down because there are so few children being born. It's not a viable business model to sell children's clothes anymore. And so we are seeing that these civilizations, if you follow this to its inevitable conclusion, they're simply going to cease to exist, because they are, sure, they're doing the productive work of building things like computers and cars and things like that, but they are not doing the reproductive work in order to keep this civilization afloat. And so eventually there's just not going to be any people. On top of that, things like competency, things like IQ, are to a very large extent hereditary. And so if the people who are doing productive work are not passing on their lineage because they're focused entirely on productive work and they're not doing any reproductive work, then future generations are going to be, I have to be careful about how I talk about that. They're going to be less fit to do productive work over time because they're just not going to be as genetically capable. I don't like that is the case. I'm not a fan of it, but that is definitively the case, that over half of a person's IQ score comes from genetics. And in classes, we would typically lie about this. We would say that it's about 50-50 nature and nurture. But in reality, it's 50-50 nature and nurture very early on in life. And then actually, as a person gets older, the influence of genes becomes even more predominant. I believe it was something like 80%. A person's IQ in adulthood is about 80% influenced by genetics and only 20% influenced by potentially nature, which is another unfortunate thing, which is that it might not be just nature, but it might actually be the interaction of genes and nature that leads to that other 20%, which would be things like epigenetic changes. So it's not necessarily genetic, but it's the activation or deactivation of certain genes in order to make the person more or less intelligent. And so just an unfortunate reality, but the way society is currently structured, in the West at least, it tends to be that the people doing the most productive work and are likely the most capable of productive work because they're the ones doing it, so they've been able to compete and get those jobs, are the least likely to reproduce, and the people most likely to reproduce are the people least fit for productive work. And so that's just not a recipe for a functioning civilization. If it was the case that genetics mattered very minimally or none at all, then sure, you could do that. You could have that type of situation, but that's not a situation that leads to a functioning society, given what we know of genetics, epigenetics, and nurture. And on top of that, even if you get rid of the role of genetics, we're clearly seeing that having some people do all of the productive work while other people do some of the reproductive work is still not working, because the fertility rate in these countries where the least productively competent people are only ones reproducing, they still don't have a fertility rate high enough to maintain the population or even grow the population. So it's not working. The current situation of getting rid of things like gender roles, getting rid of the separation of productive and reproductive work, that type of thing is just not working. You have to have both within a society. Okay, so to move on with this article, because we spent a little bit too long on that, the ideology of love, obviously of Christian origin, has done considerable harm, not only on the political level, as we shall see later on, but also at the level of the family. Firstly, marriage for love, then amorous concubinage have been the grave of the family and of the stable couple by a very complex sociological process. Okay. So they're saying marriage for love and then just kind of sleeping around with as many people as you want and cheating and stuff like that has destroyed the family unit. It is not civil unions which have been elevated to the rank of marriage, but marriage which has been lowered to the rank of a civil union. Okay, so that's an interesting way of putting it. I do think that we see this quite a bit in society, which is that if someone or something is doing better than others, it's not that we prop up the things that are doing worse, it's that we pull down the things that are doing better. And you see that quite frequently. When it comes to racial differences in academic achievement and job performance, it does tend to be the case that people of European and Asian backgrounds, let's say, tend to be more successful academically and on the job, and those people tend to be pulled down in order to create a more equitable situation, as they would like to say. That's all I'll say on the matter. So to move on, since the 1960s, an explosion in the rate of the divorce, the number of single-parent families, the spectacular growth in the number of bachelors, the social isolation of the elderly, the educational deficiencies, and so on, have all marked the collapse of the traditional family in the West. So these things, which are definitively, objectively occurring, we can see these statistically looking at the numbers, these are the results of the current way we we conduct ourselves in a civilization. And it's very clear that the collapse of traditional ways of doing things in a civilization has not led to the benefits that people hoped for. And it's because of the fact that people just did not have an understanding about how a civilization is supposed to function and how it's supposed to thrive. Something worth thinking about here is that maybe whenever we have a system that functions very well, we might not even be able to defend how or why it's functioning so well, because it's just such an instinctive thing that it's working, such as the delineation of responsibilities between males and females. That was working so well for so long that people didn't actually have an argument for why it worked or why it was necessary. And so when people came about and said, hey, why are women not in the workplace? We did not actually have a good justification for it, because it just worked within civilization. And what we're realizing is there were a lot of ramifications to that people just didn't know, but our ancestors knew through trial and error of trying a bunch of different things and seeing what worked. And we just didn't write it down. We didn't have a tip of our mind defense for why there was this delineation of responsibilities, things like that. Anyways, let's move on. I spent a little bit too much time talking. Sociologists speak of an explosion of happy divorces. The rate of divorce by mutual consent or joint request is exploding. One often sees a father, his ex-wife, and the new stepfather going on vacation or getting along superficially. In fact, with the children of the first as well as of the second marriage. In the schools, the number of children who are part of a permanent and stable traditional family with parents who have never divorced is becoming a minority. Two newly divorced spouses form a family reconstituted from the children of both. President Sarkozy of France, former president. President Sarkozy's family, before his second divorce and third marriage, set the example at the very moment of his election as head of state. The 2004 Act, I believe this person must be French then, the author of this article. The 2004 Act, by drastically simplifying that of the 1975 on divorce by mutual consent, in fact, instituted divorce by repudiation, an undertaking which is viable even without the consent of one spouse. This means that it is not a civil union which have been elevated to the rank of marriage, but marriage which has been lowered to the rank of a civil union. Moreover, a majority of deputies on the right in 2010 rejected a proposed amendment aiming to make marriage fiscally more advantageous than civil unions. Okay. In fact, well, I'll see if they say it here. I don't think they will. In fact, we are witnessing the suppression of marriages as the institution which prevailed, broadly speaking, among all social classes for several centuries. Okay, so going back to this for a second, they were going to make marriages more beneficial than a civil union. But in fact, what we've seen in modern civilization is that they've actually made divorce more financially beneficial, at least for one party, the female, than marriages. And so you're in a system where not only marriage is not of benefit to the male, but it's actually a significant downside because, and I would say it's a downside for the female as well, because it actually encourages the female to get a divorce in order to take money away from the male. And so we have a current governmental structure where the women in a relationship, in a marriage, are constantly tempted to screw over the male. That should very obviously be something that we consider to be a downside, a danger of the modern institution, the legal institution of marriage. If you have a society built around tempting the woman to screw over the male, it's not going to lead to a functional system. And we've seen that. Women are at all-time high on antidepressants across the West. Men are at all-time high in terms of suicides. This is not a recipe for success. And you can, to a certain extent, blame the individual woman for being tempted to divorce the male. But I think you have to step back and not only look at the trees, but the entire forest, and say that if a society is going out of its way to tempt women to screw over men, their husbands, for profit, that's a bad society. Like, that's a really bad society. And I've seen this countless times. It's not just an exaggeration. It's a horrific reality. And it leads to a lot of negative outcomes, both for both the former husband and wife, but also for any children they might have had, and for anyone else watching, and for the families of those two people as well. It's horrible. The state in modern Western civilization, the state is in direct contradiction, is in direct opposition to the family unit. So moving on in this article, as sociologist Jean-Claude Legoff writes, in the 1950s and 60s, institutions like marriage carried more weight, as well as both an affective and institutional dimension. Keeping a mistress was tolerated, but divorce strongly approved. Oh yeah, you know this is in France then, because they had mistresses there. Since the 1970s, the institutional dimension of marriage has been steadily disappearing. Couples find the divorce procedure far easier on the social level, but the drama experienced in a more private way is intensified and sometimes becomes even more difficult to live through. In terms of making divorces easier, it's been found in, I believe it was China, where if you just add a 30-day pause from the time a person initially asks for a divorce to initiate the divorce, that actually divorce goes down. And so some people go through a divorce process very impulsively while they're hot-tempered, and they eventually regret the decision. But the process is so easy to get a divorce that they don't actually have time to go back on that regret. They've already committed to the decision, and it's just a horrible system. Literally the system, it's so bad right now, the marriage system in Western societies is so bad it has to be by choice. It has to be something that evil people came up with directly to attack the institution of marriage, to attack the Western couple. There's no way that this could have arose just by chance. It's so anti-human, or anti-Westerner at the very least. Anyways, part of the current of the times is not showing that one is affected by it. Our society refuses to recognize what is tragic, but the psyche is subject to influence, and this cannot willfully be prevented. Feelings leave their traces in the unconscious, and it's not always good to bury them. Okay, let's see where we're at now. Oh wow, I've not made as much progress on this as I want. Couples increasingly immature and afflicted by extended adolescence separate at the first storm and as soon as the phase of infatuation ends. Okay, so that's another thing that I think is worth going over, is that people do not know how to handle conflict, do not know how to resolve conflicts. I've seen this where, like, there'll be times where I'm completely and totally 100% right, but we end up having to go with a different answer whenever I'm arguing with someone, because in modern times, people just don't know how to be wrong, or they don't know how to resolve issues. I think they get their negotiating skills, their argumentation skills from just watching TV, where like both sides are always wrong no matter what. And so it's really interesting how, because divorce is so easy in Western society, people don't have to learn how to resolve conflicts in a productive manner. They can just instantaneously get a divorce. Okay, so we see this is very harmful for the mental development of children, particularly when the family unit undergoes reconstitution, since it disconnects the ideas of conjugality and parenthood. Previously, people stayed together and overcame their difficulties as a couple because of the children, and out of faithfulness to the family lineage, committing to raising children together in a wholesome and stable environment. Today, self-interested individualism is rampant and couples break up in spite of the children. Despite all the treacly talk about compassion and protection, children, mere luxury playthings, are no longer prioritized. Yeah, that's been another heinous thing in modern society, which is that people don't know the role of having a family and what the importance is of having children. Something that I'll go over in another video, because this is already getting a little bit too long. In the midst of these deformed families, the psychological development, indeed the intellectual capacities of children and adolescents, are necessarily hugely disturbed. This is a real step backward from the European family model. Blood ties are broken insofar as The family is a microcosm of the nation, the cell to its body, guaranteeing its homogeneity. The loss of the very concept of family lineage and that of family tradition and inheritance in the biological and social senses is one of the root causes of the loss of ethnic and racial consciousness, as well as indifference to miscegenation and colonization by mass immigration. I'm not going to comment on some of this just because I don't want to get banned from YouTube. And so let's see what we can comment on here. I think one thing worth mentioning here is this is a good way of looking at it. So the family as a microcosm of the nation is people form increasingly complex units of organization. And so within a human body, there is various organisms, blood cell, bacteria, things like that, interacting and working together to form the human being. And then once you start having people interact with each other, you have things like, say, small teams, you might have organizations, you might have a nation state, and there needs to be a certain level of cohesion, a certain level of interaction, and there's even certain rules that the human body instinctively has, and there are certain rules that the organization has to have, or the nation state has to have in order to be successful at functioning as a cohesive whole. And we're seeing that things like individualism break that down. If I had to describe individualism, I would say it's like every cell in my heart having to agree to pump the blood of my heart in order to get blood to the rest of my body. It's a really weird thing. It's not how cells, it's not how organisms, it's not how human beings naturally function. They naturally function as a cohesive whole. But for some reason, this very infectious individualism, which I still believe comes from the Enlightenment, not from Christianity, but from the Enlightenment, that has taken hold. And so now for complex systems to work, every individual within the system has to agree on every component of the system. So that's not an efficiently functioning system. You have to wait for every single piece of the system to agree. So anyways, I will move on there. It's just a thought that I would like you to think about a little bit further, because it's something that is important for a society to function, is that cohesiveness element. Okay, I believe this is the last section. It's still really long, but it is the last section. So we'll get through this. The politicization of love, symptoms of neo-totalitarianism. The overuse of the word love is characteristic of our age. In the English-speaking world especially, we should also note the overabundant use of the term love in Christian rhetoric since the 1960s. Okay, so they say that this is something that originates from Christianity, but it's really Christianity of the 1960s, which I would not say is traditional Christianity. And since the Enlightenment occurred before Christianity of the 1960s, then we can, I think, conclude that actually this type of individualism occurred because of the Enlightenment. And you could say that the Enlightenment influenced Christianity to be more individualistic, and then say that maybe that influenced individualism, but I don't think that's true, because the maladaptive form of individualism that we have in modern society occurred before the 1960s. But anyways, we can move on. God is love is a theological affirmation seldom used by Christianity until the middle of the 20th century, and unknown to Judaism and Islam. The increase in references to love in Western ideology is a secularization of Christian charity, paradoxically coinciding with massive de-Christianization. At the same time, churches have converted to the worship of the rights of man, formerly rejected because of its profane and materialistic character. Materialism is another one of the ailments of Western society. This cult forms the basis of the official and quasi-legally binding Western ideological vulgate, from which arise three principal imperatives: humanitarianism, anti-discrimination, and anti-racism, each inscribed on the tablets of the law. This politicization of the idea of love has occasioned not only a gigantic tidal wave of humanitarian discourse, but also immense public expenditure, and especially in favor of growing foreign populations whose parasitic character it is illegal to denounce. The unbridled humanitarian cult of love for the other is not merely a symbol of emasculation and ethno-masochism in Western populations, as I've demonstrated many times in other writings. It is also accompanied by, and this is only an apparent paradox, an explosion in social violence, criminality, violence of representation, audiovisual media, awakening of civic and economic honesty, the withdrawal of citizens into communitarian folds, the expansion of Islamist fanaticism, the appearance of barbarous primitivism in the large fringe of the youth, mainly of foreign origin, despite discrimination in their favor, and for working and middle-class native French, severe deterioration of their quality of life and their civil liberties. Okay, so what am I allowed to comment on here? Let's see. I think the one thing I would comment on here is you can have different cultures, different civilizations, and all of them have unique characteristics that are positives and negatives of their civilization, of their culture. That does not mean that these cultures could work together stably within one nation state, because they are part of different civilizations, they are part of different cultures, and they could be entirely incompatible. And we, quite frankly, do see this across the West, where people are not recognizing that the idea of coexist just does not make sense. If you have one group whose foundational beliefs directly oppose another group's foundational beliefs, the idea of coexistence does not make sense. An example of this might be ancient Carthage, or the ancient American civilizations used to practice things like human sacrifice, child sacrifice, and other cultures are in opposition to child sacrifice, human sacrifice. And the notion that these cultures can coexist is a ridiculous notion. They should not exist within the same nation state, and to a decent extent, they'd probably want to destroy each other. Now, I'm not saying that every difference between cultures, between civilizations is that dire, but it is certainly that dire, at least in that example, when it comes to things like human sacrifice, or maybe like you could say slavery as well, if different civilizations believe in it and others don't. And so the notion of coexisting, that you can just take anyone into a nation state and it'll all just work out if you just leave everyone to do whatever they want and you kind of just celebrate absolutely everything. That's a notion of moral relativism that has literally never worked within a society. It's never functioned. It's never led to a cohesive society. It, by definition, cannot lead to a cohesive society because it's the opposite of cohesion. So I think that's all I'm going to comment on here, because this video is like 40 minutes long already. The covert and sometimes avowed purpose of this ideology of love for the other, or xenophilia, is the destruction of the European people in the cultural and physical sense, the disappearance of Europe. This ideology of obligatory love for the other functions as sort of soft form of totalitarianism, in which public discourse flies in the face of the observable social facts. A phenomenon similar in part to what was seen in the Soviet Union, though minus the gulags. Power is monopolized by a doctrinaire professorial caste with exclusive access to the mass media, whose ideas are not shared by the majority of the native population. Yeah, we see this all the time, where what the government does, what the elites do within a society, completely directly oppose what the majority of people want within a society. And it's not the people that end up winning that. It's the elites who are in government, who control all the mechanisms of power, who end up deciding things. Which, again, if this is a totalitarian society, that would make complete sense, because the people in charge get to make the decisions. But in a supposed democratic society, it's the people that should have the final say. And so the West is just simply not democratic in any way, shape, or form. Opponents can only express themselves in marginal outlets, and even then at the risk of defying the law, for as Marxist-Leninists used to do in communist countries in order to protect their dogma, this caste has reintroduced limitations which get more extensive over time on freedom of expression, even of thought, not to mention limitations on property rights and the freedom to hire at will. This ideology, protected by a generation of judges who share it, whether sincerely or not matters little, does not hesitate to violate the Declaration of the Rights of Man, to whose authority they appeal in order to justify unconstitutional freedom-killing laws, and in order to leave the realm of positive law by a return to subjective, introspective law similar to Soviet or medieval law. As in the Soviet world, today's ideologues are not content with disseminating their views via the communication media, but seek also to diffuse it monopolistically through the school system. And so I talk about this all the time, that if your faction is not controlling the school system within a society, then some other faction is going to be controlling it. That's just how it works, where because the vast majority of people take on whatever worldview they're taught, the education system is a great way to co-opt large segments of society, because especially in modern society where both parents are typically working, they don't have the time to instill values, to instill a certain worldview on their children, or even if they do to a certain extent, the school system has more access to people's children than the parents typically do. And so they have more time to enforce a certain worldview on the children. And then once people get into adulthood, they really don't change their beliefs overly much. I think one of the main things I would tell you is, and this should be very concerning to you, and I like to emphasize this a lot, but the vast majority of people, when it comes to their moral compass, they get it from like children's superhero cartoons. I'm not even joking. I've noticed this a lot, where if you like ask people various moral questions, their reasons for believing the things that they believe, you can directly tie it to, say, them watching like Batman or Superman as a child, or like Captain Planet or something like that. Because people, I'm being completely serious here, the vast majority of people, they will watch a cartoon of their favorite superhero and see caricatures with opposition and see what the superhero does and how it tends to work out no matter what. And they will just implement that as their own perspective, as their own moral compass. And so most people never make an intentional decision to think through the various aspects of their morality as an adult. They just implement wholesale the morality of, say, a Superman or a Batman, which should be horrifically concerning, because there is someone behind the scenes making those cartoons who controls the entire morality of a society. But we've allowed this to occur for generations now. Anyways, I'll move on. Okay, so which has ceased to be an apparatus of public instruction, only to become one of public upbringing, completely correct for education system, i.e. a propaganda apparatus in the service of official dogma, especially in the matters of history and morality. It can be said without exaggeration that in today's free Europe, as in the totalitarian regimes of the early 20th century, described by Hannah Arendt, the media culture and the educational system agree in not diffusing anything but this ideology, and that any who violate it are either marginalized or otherwise punished. Everything is done to keep their voice from being heard. The internet, as well, is clearly subject to censorship, if not total shutdown of some websites. People are getting punished for what they say online too, even if it's not violent things that they're espousing. The internet's reach is exaggerated anyways, given the dilution of messages and the enormous mass of competing messages, and with so many niche websites. But above all, these websites, most frequented by the general public, the only effective ones, are impermeable by any dissident thought. So that should be concerning, because these platforms, they're not allowed to be sued for the things that they say online, and yet they are platforms, and so people should have the freedom to openly discuss things, because it's supposedly the marketplace of ideas. That's where you're not publishing things, you're not a publisher. But for some reason, they're allowed to have all the benefits of being a publisher while having the legal shield of being a platform. And yet they're not required to allow Americans to have freedom of thought, or people in other countries to have the freedom of thought and freedom of speech that they're supposed to have given their legal rights. But anyways, we can move on from that. So the article goes on, disagreements can only be expressed under surveillance and sealed bubbles visited only by those in the know. So yeah, that's the Overton window. Finally, the covert and sometimes avowed purpose of this ideology of love for the other, or xenophilia, is the destruction of European peoples in the cultural and physical sense, i.e. the disappearance of Europe. The constant defense of race mixing and immigration supposedly so beneficial. I'm not going to comment on this at all. So there's something here that I will comment on, though, which is that you're allowed to agree with some of a person's ideas without agreeing with all of their ideas, okay? And that's something that's completely allowed. So I'm pointing out things that I agree with in this article and just kind of skimming over the other things I disagree with, because if I wanted to talk about things that I disagree with, I would probably make another video on this. Along with the prohibition on the imposing them are a part of the strategy, just like the numerous attempts to destroy national historical memory or the imposition of officially subsidized Fox art. The central paradigm of the ideology of love for the other is better than we are. We must learn from him, for we are inherently guilty and bad. The other is more at home among us than we are. This amounts to a monstrous deformation of Christian charity, which results in a totalitarian ideology that destroys all social bonds and produces violence and servility. Okay, so I think this is the longest video I've produced so far. It's been over 45 minutes now. So if you found this video to be helpful, if you stuck with me throughout the entire video, I appreciate you very much. But if you found it to be helpful, please give us a thumbs up. It helps us in the algorithm. Please subscribe to our channel for more content, YouTube and Rumble. Trying to get on podcast players, etc., but I'll talk more about that later. Please leave a comment in the comment box below, questions, concerns, critiques you might have. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Bye.